Well, thank you all for attending this workshop today, or this conference, whatever you want to call it. And really, I want to recognize all of you for what you do to make the world a better place. It's wonderful to receive an award like this, but it makes me really stop and think. So many people do special things to make the world a better place that everyone deserves a mini award of their own. So thank you all. Okay, moving on. I also want to thank, whoops, I'm having trouble advancing my screen. I want to express my gratitude to the Botanic Garden, of course, for this award, but also because of the things that they are doing regionally in the area of conservation with their focus. Now, Denise presented it as 3 tiers. I didn't know she was going to do that, but I present it this way, that they bring together research, application by working with managers, and education and outreach. And it is these same 3 approaches to doing what I do that characterize the restoration work that I've done and that I'll talk about today. And so I want to first give thanks to the people who have helped me do this, the fund sources that have helped in the research that I'll talk about, the management groups that I have worked with to help hone questions and make sure that our research has applicability, and the dozens of undergraduates and graduate students, postdocs, and other volunteers that I've had the privilege of working with over the years. Many, many interesting and fun colleagues with whom I've had lots of conversations, either about restoration or about wildland fire, who have helped hone my views on this for several decades. And finally, my parents, seen here last year at their 71st wedding anniversary, who instilled in me a love for the sense of discovery that drives the work that I do. And it was my mother who taught me how to plant plants and the excitement of watching them grow. So I'd like to honor them today. Okay, we live on a fire planet, and this image that you see here is a conglomeration of images from 1 year of remote sensing from satellites, showing the radiative power of fire across the globe in the year 2020. And what I want you to notice here is not just the bright spots in Africa and South America and the Western US, but in fact, the fact that so much of the globe is impacted by wildland fire. And in fact, much of it is impacted directly through direct combustion of organic material from plants and soils, or houses even. But lots of the rest of the world is impacted by the transport of materials released by fire. So often places that are thousands of miles from active burning fronts are heavily affected by atmospheric transport. And fire also contributes to global warming and a feedback loop whereby the carbon that was fixed into plants is released back to the atmosphere, contributing to the greenhouse effect, contributing to fuel aridification and potentially to more fire. So fire is going to continue to have a big impact on our planet through these positive feedback loops. Yet I want to shrink down and think at a local scale, what does fire do? Fire has been an evolutionary force across the globe for millennia. Fire has created all sorts of adaptations of plants to live in places that have fire. But it's not just fire itself, it's fire within the context of a fire regime. And so I want to walk through what a fire regime is with you to help you understand how things are changing on the planet. So when we think of a fire regime, we need to think of a whole variety of different characteristics, such as seasonality. When do the fires occur relative to plant growth or to rainfall? Return interval. Many people think of this as frequency, but it's really the interval of time between fires that plays a role in whether species can evolve and respond to fire or not. the size and continuity of the fire, the intensity and severity. And here I separate these two, with intensity being the heat released by the fire and severity being the impacts on the vegetation. And finally, the type of fire. So some places fires tend to burn in the understory or in the ground layer, and other places in the canopy. And that's what I mean by type of fire. So it's really these fire regimes that differ geographically by climate and location, and that plants are evolved to respond to. So if adaptations to fire regimes are common throughout these fire-prone ecosystems on the globe, why have I asked this question of when and why would we do post-fire restoration? And there are really three reasons I'm going to focus on why post-fire restoration has become essential instead of just letting ecosystems recover on their own. The first is that the species pool is changing. And here I'm referring specifically to introduced species that have become widespread on their own and become prevalent, particularly after fire. And here's an example: two grass species, the Sonoran Desert on the first picture to the left. In the middle, you see giant reed in the Santa Clara River. And on the right, you see a tree, salt cedar, that's invaded desert riparian areas, bringing more fire into those places. So these things change the response of the systems to fire, and they often promote, having trouble advancing, more fire, creating positive feedbacks to favor future fire. So this is a really important reason why you might want to get in after fire and try to get natives back instead of these non-native species. The second reason is that the fire regimes themselves are changing, and often this is due to humans. So for example, in the Sierra Nevada, we've seen return intervals between fires getting much longer than was the case when Europeans first arrived here through fire suppression. But in Southern California, we're seeing much more frequent fire through human ignition. And then the third thing that is causing us to have to think about doing restoration in the face of fire is that climate is changing. The post-fire environment is often now inhospitable for the regeneration of those very same species that have evolved in this fire regime. So together, these numbers 2 and 3 lead to the loss of resilience of the native species. And it's this loss of resilience that allows the invasive species to tend to dominate these sites. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to use two different case studies to talk about not just the when and why, which I've already given you some insight into, but the really challenging issue of how to approach post-fire restoration in these changing landscapes. And I'll use the Hawaiian dry forest and California chaparral as my examples, because in both of these cases, invasive species have contributed to changing fire regimes, or humans have contributed to changing fire regimes, and invasive species are playing an important role in regeneration. So I'll start with Hawaii. I've worked in the dry forests of Hawaii for 32 years now. And most people think of Hawaii as a place full of tropical green, lush plants where fire would not be an important evolutionary force. But in fact, most of the islands have a windward and a leeward side, and the leeward side tends to be dry or seasonally dry. Yet fire was not an important evolutionary force except at higher elevation where lightning occurred. And part of the reason is that they don't have fuels that carry fire across these landscapes until the introduction of invasive pasture grasses in the late 18 and early 1900s. And these grasses have come in, they were brought in mostly for grazing, and filled in the space between the native shrubs and trees and created a fuel bed that has now changed the landscape and resulted in a widespread occurrence of fire. So here's a transect that I've been monitoring with my collaborator, Stephanie Jelinek here. I've followed the same transects now for almost 40 years. And after fire in many of these sites, you see the almost complete conversion to African grass domination. So we've documented and published that fire size increases enormously, fire frequency increases. There's a pretty significant loss of native species, and that invaders persist for decades, and the sites tend to reburn. So frequent fire and invasive grasses are eliminating entire assemblages and creating the grass fire cycle. So in terms of thinking about when and why, most of these lands I'm talking about are controlled by the National Park Service. And their goal is to preserve and protect the biodiversity of these unique Hawaiian ecosystems. So what do they do in the face of these threats? How can you approach restoration when you need to try to enhance diversity, but you're facing these invasive species and fire? So the approach that we took, and I began this work in the mid-1990s when I realized just how dire the situation was, working directly with natural resources management at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. We identified potentially fire-tolerant native species. We evaluated their potential to survive with invasive grasses through research and competition. We collected and tested and stored seed. A lot of these seeds are difficult to germinate. We had to know how are we going to get them to germinate if we put them out there? And then we conducted experimental seeding of our species that we selected into burned sites. So we took sites that had already burned and we conducted prescribed fire. So we used disturbance to our advantage to create a window in which to get native species back in the system before the grasses came back, which is an eventuality there. So we had usually about a 2-year window to get native species established. So we did not try, these are some of our winner species. We did not try to go back to this pre-fire assemblage because the dominant tree and the most abundant understory shrub do not come back at all and cannot tolerate competition with grasses. So we decided you really have to go forward to something new. And this looks kind of messy here, but it's actually one of our seeded plots with 3 different natives sharing dominance on the right side here, but still growing with some of those invasive grasses. So our lesson here is that in the face of these really significant threats, you can't go back to the pre-fire state. So if you want a native species assemblage, you need to have novel solutions and to create novel assemblages. And this was really a controversial idea when I first presented it to Hawaii Volcanoes National Park at a public forum. But since then, I think most people have accepted that this novel assembly approach has to be the route forward in order to keep native species in these ecosystems. So let's jump to fire regime and restoration in Chaparral. So looking back at this diagram of fire regime, let's think about what is the characteristic of a fire regime for Chaparral. And these numbers here come from a paper by Keeley and Fotheringham. The fire regime was considered historically to be something that fires burning in June through October, return intervals varying from 30 to 100 years, depending on how dry or moist the habitat is. So in San Diego County, for example, where it's much drier, fire return intervals tend to be more frequent. And in Central California and interior Santa Barbara County, fire return intervals tend to be longer. So fire size is variable, intensity and severity is typically quite high, and the type of fire that burns in Chaparral is a crown fire. And a lot of people are confused by that because Chaparral seems like, oh, it's shrubs, they're an understory, but there is no overstory. They are the understory and the overstory. The understory under them does sometimes burn by itself if you're in a riparian zone, but otherwise it's bottom from the soil to the crown that burns. So high intensity crown fire is the norm in Chaparral. So no matter whether you read about a devastating fire that just toasted all the vegetation, that's the norm. Species are adapted to it. These high intensity fires stimulate the germination of obligate seeding species, such as these Ceanothus megacarpus seedlings seen here, that are stimulated through smoke and heat to germinate. And resprouting shrubs that have lignotubers below ground also are stimulated to resprout after fire. So this is the norm. But what's happening in Chaparral due to humans and invasive ignitable grasses is an increase in fire seasonality. So we now have fires from May through December and January. Part of that is due to climate drying. And we're seeing some areas where return intervals are 2 to 30 years, so much shorter than was considered the norm. I won't talk much about the intensity and severity changes, but there's some evidence that once you start to lose some of the chaparral species and gain invasive grasses, actually intensity goes down. But let's focus really here on this changing fire return interval, because we believe this is really the key to loss of chaparral. And as an example that we know we have shortened fire return intervals, here's a view. We live up in the mountains here, looking over in the San Ynez Valley on the other side of Paradise Road. This hillside in the foreground burned in the White Rock Fire in 2013, and then again in the Ray Fire in 2016. So only 3 years between fire. So we are starting to see these short fire intervals, even in Santa Barbara County. This is a map created by my student Stephanie Ma showing short fire return intervals in Ventura and Los Angeles counties, the green showing area that was mapped as chaparral in the 1930s, and the brownish colors being the places where we're seeing these short fire return intervals. And so you can see that it's quite extensive through the Santa Monica Mountains and through some of these other areas to now have places that are burning in less than 10-year intervals. So why is this a problem? Well, an important real issue here is that obligate seeding shrubs, such as these Ceanothus seedlings, take about 10 years, 8 to 10 years, to start putting seed back into the soil seed bank, where they will then sleep until the next fire. If you can't get that seed bank replenished and another fire comes through, then those species will be knocked out of the system. And that's been documented in other parts of Southern California by John Keeley's group. Now you think, okay, so we lose a few obligate seeders. Is that a big deal? I go back to this picture that I started with to point out to you, these flowering shrubs are all obligate seeders. So this is Ceanothus megacarpus in the Santa Monica Mountains. So if you take those individuals out of this picture, all of a sudden you have a landscape with a significant amount of open space. And that open space becomes filled with introduced annual grasses from Europe that are now widespread, filling the space where obligate cedars once were. And on the left is such a patch of ground in the Santa Monica Mountains. And on the right is such a patch of ground in the Los Padres National Forest near Piru. And you might think, well, that's not really going to happen in Santa Barbara County because it's a lot more moist here. And as a result of that moisture, we do have a greater diversity of resprouting shrub species, but we also have large areas that are Ceanothus, or these obligate cedars. And here's a patch of one of those. And this is an area that burned in the Jesucita fire in 2009. And the dead shrubs seen here with some of my undergraduates in a class in the background, toasted in the Thomas fire in the next year after that fire. So these shrubs were about 7 years old when they were burned again. We came in and surveyed, and we found no seedlings of Ceanothus megacarpus. We found mostly invasive grasses and some native vines. So we are starting to see the overlap of fire in some of our California Santa Barbara ecosystems. And when they are dominated by obligate cedars, we're starting to see the incursion of grass. So essentially, this is another spot that actually was the overlap of the Tea Fire and the Thomas Fire. And we see there are resprouting species coming back in here, but we're seeing this, what I would call a slow savannahization on conversion of chaparral. So what is so bad about conversion to annual grasses? Some people actually prefer having grasses around them because they're easier to clear than chaparral shrubs. Well, the first point I want to make is that they are much more ignitable. And so these are some data from my student, Robert Fitch, showing that introduced annual grass, LFM here stands for live fuel moisture. This is a really important index of the likelihood that vegetation is going to result, that ignition is going to result in a big fire. And here he shows the live fuel moisture of the annual grasses, which is that orange line, diving in May, while the live fuel moisture of chamise, our classic chaparral shrub, in green, staying much higher than this gold line. This gold line is the critical live fuel moisture level that managers look at when they worry about fire danger. And our native perennial grasses in blue, maintaining much higher live fuel moisture into the summer compared to these exotic annual grasses. And in the picture down in the left, you see these exotic grasses in a picture I took in May near my house compared to the chaparral shrubs. So basically, we're putting a lot of kindling on the landscape. And just to drive home the point that grasses are ignitable and they can fuel really destructive fires. This is an aerial photo of the Marshall Fire, which burned in Colorado in December of this year, almost New Year's Day, destroyed 1,500 homes, and it was a grass-fueled fire. It raced across grassland, and then it became a house-fueled fire when it got into these developments. But all the fuel surrounding it in which it initially spread were grasses. And one more point about grasses being so ignitable, an analysis of home loss in the Santa Monica Mountains by Alex Seifard suggested that homes that were surrounded mostly by grass had a somewhat higher probability of burning than those surrounded by other vegetation types. And she doesn't provide much more insight on that, but it could be because most fires are preceded before the flaming front gets to the house by an ember storm. And that ember storm is going to ignite the grasses, causing fire to get to the houses much more quickly than it otherwise might. So what is so bad about conversion? Well, the first point was increased ignitability and the possibility of more and more fire. Grasslands of the world burn at higher fire or low fire return intervals compared to shrublands. Reduced biodiversity and wildlife, decreased infiltration of water during winter rains because there are no pathways for that water to infiltrate along the root systems of plants. Grass roots are very shallow. And also because the canopy is very homogeneous and not as good at deflecting the impact of rainfall as a shrub canopy. Increased erosion, and then finally reduced overall productivity and carbon storage. And carbon storage is incredibly important because nowadays we're trying to get carbon out of the atmosphere and back into the soil or into these slow turnover pools. So where is this conversion happening? I've already given you an idea that it's more abundant, more likely to happen in the South. And we did an analysis recently on conversion in parts of Ventura County within the Los Padres National Forest, asking the question, what parts of the landscape are most vulnerable to change? And the important point here, this is a graphic created by my student Shane DeWeese, that chaparral, which is in the green on the left in 1930, made up more than half of the vegetation type. But by the time you get to 2009, it's making up a lot less, and it's converting when you follow these flow lines, the gray flow, it's converting to grass. So grass, which made up a relatively small proportion of the aerial photos in the 1930s, becomes much more abundant by 2009, and sage scrub vegetation also disappears, almost disappears. So using a complex spatial analysis tool, we concluded that the most vulnerable areas are southwest facing slopes. Those are going to be more arid, lower elevation chaparral, and that tends to be where obligate cedars like Ceanothus megacarpus dominate, places with shorter fire return intervals. And this next point, fire followed by strong multi-year drought, brings in the issue of post-fire climate and its relative importance in shaping what's able to recover in those sites. And then places close to roads also converted. So that means the places where we're going to want to do restoration are going to be hot, dry places on low elevation and south-facing slopes. And they're going to be closer to roads where there's a greater chance of ignition. And so those are exactly the sorts of sites that we are trying to put some vegetation back in. So the goals that we've had in these projects that I've been working with my students on are to establish natives that persist or recover if fire does occur, because it certainly will occur, that support wildlife, pollinators, and food webs, that potentially outcompete or at least reduce the grasses and thus the future ignition probability, that store more carbon than these grasses by putting a lot of that carbon below ground, and then that might act as nodes of spread to the surrounding area. So we want species that hopefully could spread on their own. So how do we pick a pool of species in a landscape like this? Well, we do it in a few ways. The first thing we do is try to identify what we think the pre-degradation dominants are. And part of that involved like climbing up to this little patch of dark green up here on that hill slope, and looking at aerial photos to see places that didn't burn in the 3 fires that burned this area, and seeing what was there. And when we do that, we see these dark green leaved species. And I want you to get a nice impression in your brain here of what these species look like. Then we look at what's there today, these what I'm calling post-degradation, or just, I guess it should be degradation species. And when we look at those, we see a very different looking group of species, white powdery leaves, just totally different. And these are species that are more characteristic of what we consider to be sage scrub vegetation. So I just want you to compare those. Again, it's very interesting to me because the pre-degradation versus the post-degradation species make you, just the way they look, make you realize that physiologically something is going on in these degraded environments. And then we also considered a whole bunch of other species that are either very hard to find at the site or are somewhere nearby that we consider to be drought tolerant. And those include a wide range of things from, believe it or not, elderberry, which can actually do pretty well in these sites, black sage, chamise, laurel sumac, other things. So because we want to have diversity, we don't want to just put back the sage scrub species. So we've been planting these out, and Shane and Stephanie will tell you a lot more about that today, and focusing on different combinations of species and asking questions like, what are the traits of the winners and the losers? Do some combinations of species work better to achieve our goals of cover and suppression of grasses and carbon accumulation? And what parts of the landscape are easier to restore? So although the slope on the left looks like a fairly homogeneous slanted slope with grasses and a few scattered shrubs, there's actually a lot of heterogeneity to this landscape, and Shane might mention some of that work. Now, an additional approach that we're taking, and this is part of Stephanie's dissertation, is to ask the question, can the sage scrub species that are out there today be used as facilitators, hypothesizing that maybe some chaparral species can be facilitated by sage scrub species. And she's planted some of these into the understory of some of these sage scrub species. So the reality of this situation, like the situation in Hawaii, but maybe not quite as dire, is that we aren't likely to be able to go back, or at least it's very hard to go back. And what we might have to go forward to is a much more sage scrubby community, because that's a vegetation formation where most of the species are adapted to these hotter, drier conditions that might characterize the future. So we are looking for how to make a diverse and interesting community, and really hoping to get some re-sprouters in there that can persist in the new environmental conditions. So I want to end by saying that I hope these two examples, which are depressing in that they show that we're losing biodiversity and ecosystem function through this combination of changing fire regimes and invasive species, and that we can't easily go back, but that we can go forward, and we must go forward through solutions that are forward-looking and that focus on function and not on the strict idea of restoring to what was there before. And that to go forward, we have to engage new ideas and diverse partnerships. And so I'll end by going back to my triangle and saying that this combination of research, application, education, and outreach can come together so easily in restoration, that restoration offers the opportunity to engage people in the landscape, in the process of discovery, and in working directly to make a better landscape today. So restoration is a way to reconnect people with the landscape and to help people to take pride in creating and maintaining the beauty and functioning of our landscapes. And with that, I'll stop and thank you again for being here.
Carla, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that overview, and I'm sure our audience did too. So we have a few minutes for questions, and we got a couple in the Q&A. Thank you, everybody. Andrea asks, have you ever tried to interplant the sensitive natives after good growth of the tougher natives to increase diversity and bring back some aspects of the old community?
Well, that's an excellent question, and that is the direction that we'd like to go in. And so some of our current planting efforts are aimed at trying the sage scrub species first, because we think that they're definitely going to establish the best and most readily. And then once they're established, planting in the chaparral, more sensitive chaparral species. And that's kind of related to the issue of can these sage scrub species be facilitators for the chaparral species? We know that some things like toyon are dispersed by birds, and so they're likely to get defecated out. The seeds are, going to be defecated out underneath places where birds perch, which are other trees and shrubs. So this idea of facilitation seems really promising. So far, the trouble we've had is that, we're doing this restoration in a really dry series of years. And so we're not getting fantastic establishment right away. And that makes it hard to get to that next step where we get to try to use the sensitive species. But I think it's a great point, Andrea, and I thank you for that question.
Okay, so next one is from Scott Cooper. He asks, do frequent high severity fires result in type conversion of forests to shrubland?
Yes, that's another very good question. I haven't studied forest conversion that much, although a person who had worked in my lab and did a master's in Bren, Anne-Marie Parkinson, did some work on the loss of conifer forests in the southern forests, particularly in the Zaka fire area. And we do see loss of conifers when there's crown fire and conversion to shrubland systems. This idea has been recognized for several decades. Dennis Odian, who had worked at the garden many decades ago and is now deceased, had recognized this alternation between conifer forest and shrubland as a result of high intensity fire. So I think it's a real phenomenon. The trees may eventually come back, but it might just take many decades for that to happen. So I think it's certainly a phenomenon we're going to be documenting more and more regionally across California with these high intensity crown fires that are being observed.